Fantastic. So as you can tell, maybe not quite the slick operation you might be used to here at the Center for Yoga Studies, but still, I'm just really, really happy to be able to come back to introduce Sheena Sood here today. I'm going to do the sensible bit first and read you her bio. So Sheena Sood is currently pursuing a PhD in the social sciences at Temple University. No?
Somehow you'll have the old.
Which what now?
You have the old.
Oh, I don't know. You are a doctor. You've done the thing now. Oh, of course you have. You are now Dr. Sood. Join the thing. But
apparently, all good.
Oh, good. Okay. But apparently, but anyway, her research explores the kind of application of yoga and mindfulness within governmental institutions, and specifically when it comes to issues around militarization and yoga, which is a fantastic, fascinating subject, looking at India, Israel, and the US in many ways. Sheena and I work on a number of projects together. So you're contributing to at least 2 different books that I'm editing at the moment. So, you know, her work, I think, speaks for itself anyway. But I also wanted to point out that these kind of topics, being able to speak and debate around issues of decolonization and militarization and yoga and so on, are in and of themselves necessarily controversial, contentious topics. As a result, it can actually be quite difficult to get academics to come and speak for the center on these topics, right? So we get a lot of pushback, particularly from students, saying, why don't you have lectures on this topic? And that's because people are slightly concerned about what might happen if they come and debate these topics, because they are inherently controversial in and of themselves. Saying that, I do not know a yoga studies academic whose work hasn't been considered controversial at some point in some form by somebody. We all get used to it in the end. But nonetheless, I'm hoping, and I think I know, that the SOAS Central Yoga Studies is a space where we can have these debates in a spirit of collaboration and cooperation, and wanting to move forwards with kind of honesty and justice, hopefully. So just putting that out there. If you're on the Zoom call, we haven't got a Slido or a webinar set up tonight. So if you drop kind of pertinent questions in the chat, we might be able to pick them up. We can't promise it. If we don't, it's not because we don't want to, it's because of the tech issues that we're having this evening, but we will be able to take questions from the room. Okay. Have I forgotten anything, Jim? No?
Now the Christoph Zotter and two.
Oh yeah, apparently there are talks even after I've gone. There are loads because I set them up. So Christoph Zotter is coming in a couple of weeks. What's he speaking of?
Yogis in Nepal.
Yogis in Nepal. There we go. So that'll be happening. We've got various other people, including Karen Brian Cott, that's coming back later in the term, towards the end of the term, which would be nice. Yeah, so you know, things are still continuing, even if the admin might be a bit flaky occasionally. All right, and now Dr. Sood.
Greetings. Thank you, Theo, so much. Thank you, Jim. Really appreciate being here. Good evening, everyone. How are we doing tonight? Good. Yeah. Mellow British crowd. So thank you for this warm introduction. Thank you for welcoming me here to London. I'm really grateful to be here. The seed for this talk, I believe, was planted about 2 years ago. And yeah, we made it in person. So I'm really happy that it's worked out. Theo, it's really beautiful to finally meet you in person. And Jim, I've really learned a lot from your work on the roots of yoga. So yeah, just grateful to be here at the Center for Yoga Studies and SOAS. And thank you to the Zoom attendees who are here as well. Hopefully y'all can hear me. And if anything comes up, you can just throw it in the chat. And I'll try and keep a subtle eye on it.
Sheena, welcome.
Great, thank you. So when we scheduled this visit, we did not know that it was going to coincide with the King's coronation this weekend, but somehow we're here still kind of normalizing this divine governance by a monarch. And as a social scientist, I just want to say it's rare for me to connect with other scholars of yoga studies. So I'm really honored to be here for that. And I'm really looking forward to how this talk Omwashing Yoga, the far right's weaponization of spirituality toward ethnonationalism, will land with everyone, right? How it's going to connect with other yoga studies scholars. You know, I'm primarily a social scientist, but I'm really looking forward to some sort of thoughtful feedback and exchange that we can have in the Q&A. And hopefully this topic will just inspire all of us to interrogate this topic a little more. I don't profess to have all of the answers to this topic, but I hope that it can invite all of us to ask better questions. So with that note, there we go. I just want to take a couple moments to name my own positionality as it relates to this topic of omwashing. I enter this conversation as a sociology PhD, as an activist scholar. I live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, otherwise known as occupied Lenai Lenape territories. I've been working with communities in Philadelphia for the past 13 years. And finally, I entered this conversation as a yoga practitioner and as a descendant of upper caste Hindus. I'm a South Asian Hindu from a Hindu family. And a lot of my family, my life was made possible because of my family's survival during British partition, or the exchange of people across these newly made borders in British India. And so I bring all of those identities and experiences to this conversation today. And actually, before we do this poll, I want to take a couple breaths with folks just so that we can kind of be in this space and on this in this moment together. So if you just want to take a moment and check out of the screen, maybe check into your bodies a little bit. You're welcome to roll your shoulders back. You're welcome to dim your eyes. You're welcome to close your eyes. And just take a moment and notice where your feet are. You're welcome to place your palms somewhere that feels nice, relaxing, comforting. That brings you into this present moment. You might draw a breath in and a deep exhale out. And another breath in. And a breath out. Deep breath in together. Maybe opening your mouth and letting out an exhale. And one more breath. As we take in this moment, take in this breath, maybe recognizing where we are. For me, this is really special of an opportunity. I'm on the lands of a colonial empire whose devastating impact has touched not only my people, but all of the case studies that I'm engaging today. So just taking a moment to breathe in and out, maybe noticing any discomfort that arises and naming that. And noticing how you want to show up to this conversation, maybe with openness, with an invitation, with humility. And for all of us, a desire to hopefully learn. And as you feel ready, just bringing your attention into this space. Perhaps opening your eyes. So as you may have gotten a sneak peek of, I want to start us off with a poll. It's going to be a 3-question poll, and it's the first of a few interactive activities that I want us to do together today. If you're in person, I'm not going to mandate that we pull out our phones unless you just really want to kind of participate in the online poll. If you're online, then you're welcome to kind of scan this QR code. If you're in person, you're welcome to use your phone, or you're welcome to use your thumb if you prefer to just be present. So the yoga and wellness industries, as many of us might know, are so pervasive as new age spiritual commodities that perhaps it's no surprise that their corresponding markets are multi-billion-dollar industries. In fact, in 2022, the global yoga market was valued at $105.9 billion. So given that this industry is spreading its reach, I'm curious to know how y'all feel about yoga being introduced as a therapeutic, as a strengthening, as a training program to spaces other than, the yoga studios or maybe the elementary schools, right? So you're going to see a question populate on the slide here, and I want to consider whether you'd be open to bringing yoga to that institution. So again, since we're hybrid, maybe our online folks can scan the QR code. And then if you're in person, if you think the answer is yes, you're going to put your thumb up. If you think it's no, then you're going to put your thumb down. And then if you're kind of like hesitant or somewhere in the middle, you can just put your thumb in the middle. Does that feel clear? Yeah? So first question, do you think it's a good idea for yoga to be taught in police academies or in law enforcement trainings? I see some wiggles. Okay. And then I see a couple thumbs up. How many people are thumbs down? Just so I can kind of like maybe keep, I see one thumbs down. Okay. I saw a lot of wiggles. And then how many people were up? Okay, great. Like 5 or 6 of us in person. Some of us were interested in maybe police officers getting yoga training. A couple of us were like, nah. Maybe a few of us were okay with it. New poll. How about yoga taught in prisons, including youth prisons? Yeah. So our yeses are how many? Okay. Like at least half of us. How many of us are no? Okay. 2-ish, maybe 1. And then how many of us are maybe? Maybe. Okay. Like 4 or 5 of us. How about yoga being taught in the armed forces or the military? Let's see how many are yes. Yeah. Okay. Like maybe 6 or 7 in the audience, or maybe like 8. How many are no? Maybe. A good amount. No. Absolutely not. Okay, more are like no as it relates to the military. This is great. So if I had a live poll account that I paid for, y'all would also get questions about elementary schools, government-sponsored events as alternatives to detention centers. Maybe you can think of other polls. Perhaps some of these images that I'm scrolling through, right, might give you an idea of, or, might kind of bring to mind some of the visions that y'all were able to think about. Not sure how to try and eliminate that, so I'm not going to try and bother. And then, yeah, yoga classes for youth offenders. And this is an article in the Yoga Journal, The Good Fight, How Yoga is Being Used Within the Military. As you likely gathered, my research brings a critical sociological lens to yoga's deployment in these settings, largely by analyzing content in mass media about yoga programs at these institutions. I have a lot of experience teaching in these settings at a youth prison before. I bring an autoethnographic angle to this research. I've taught at preschools, community centers, nonprofits, high schools, and as I'm happy to discuss later, maybe in the Q&A, my intention is to add an ethnographic component to this research as well. And so, for me, this research is an analysis of images related to yoga, and it's a sociological and a critical theoretical engagement with topics such as militarism, religious nationalism, supremacy, and imperialism, as it relates to their relationship with yoga and wellness industries. And so, but first, I'm going to tell y'all a couple of stories. So when I was 19 years old, I attended a meditation workshop by the Art of Living Foundation, an international nonprofit organization founded by Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, a spiritual teacher, not to be confused with the sitar player, the late sitar player, Ravi Shankar. So Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, or as he's known as Sri Sri, is known for his unique approach to sharing meditative, yogic, and breathing skills with everyday people. The Art of Living is a spiritual organization that is not directly affiliated with a religious organization per se, but he pulls heavily from Vedantic and Hindu philosophies. And I started attending the Art of Living spiritual retreats when I was first, you would say, like acquiring a language to unpack my experiences with living in the US South, like, experiences of white supremacy and, kind of unpacking colonial realities as a second generation immigrant. I attended retreats that Sri traveled to the US for, and if, I'm being honest, I was really mesmerized with his light, with his wisdom, with, all the ways in which he kind of dropped in wisdom through those retreats, and the meditative experiences. As an additional comfort, several of my AOL teachers were Indian and spoke openly about their families' memories of British colonialism, of partition, and the combination of these experiences led me to deepen my relationship to Hinduism and India, and Indian culture and history. And so I became a leader in my local Hindu Students Council chapter in college, and the AOL and HSC chapters offered me what I felt to be like a sense of belonging to my religious and racialized ethnic identity in the US as a minority, as a racial minority, as a religious minority. And it was an identity that I think I kind of subconsciously disembodied to be able to fit into a white cultural norm. So despite their ability, despite like the trust I felt in those spaces with the spiritual leaders who I was involved with, I also realized that they were introducing me to ideologies that were embedded in Islamophobia, that were embedded in caste supremacy, that were embedded in Hindu nationalism, right? A lot of the narratives that I was kind of hearing about South Asian history, about Kashmir, right? About Assam, about Bengal, about Gujarat, right? Was coming to me through this very Hindu nationalist lens, right? When it came to religious and political conflicts. And they were introducing me to these narratives through a Hindu and caste supremacist lens, in ways that made casteism seem like a vestige of the past. Ones that claimed Hindus to kind of be the eternal victims of Muslim invasions, as they would say. And even though I could feel the tentacles of Hindu nationalism or Hindutva sucking me into a web of fictitious claims on the innocence of upper caste Hindus at this time, I wasn't really prepared to let go of my meditation practice that felt like it was really strongly inviting me into like powerful breathing techniques and meditations. And then around 2007, at a time when I started building up the courage to ask questions about one-sided simplistic spiritual fables that I was being fed by the AOL, Art of Living, and HSC, my brother was the one that actually informed me about the 2002 Gujarat pogrom. How many people here have heard of the 2002 Gujarat pogrom before? Okay, cool, good to know. It was a 3-day period of anti-Muslim violence that was propelled by Hindu nationalist gangs, and it resulted in the murder of nearly 2,000 Muslims and rapes of, women and children, a lot of brutality. And evidence points to the role that then Chief Minister Narendra Modi, now Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and the Gujarat police played in instigating and condoning the orchestrated mass murder and brutalization of Muslim families. And so, like anyone confused at that time, I searched for accountability from a spiritual, from my spiritual family, from religious leadership in the Hindu Students Council, in the Art of Living. And instead, I found testimonials that were defending Modi. So Sri in particular, the glowing man, has since written about his conversations with Modi in 2004, when Modi was still the chief minister of Gujarat, or in the US, we would call that like a governor type of role. He wrote, by then the battle lines were drawn. Modi had become a pariah. Bashing him had become a fashion. People who differed even slightly with this trend were branded communal or belonging to RSS and VHP. I decided to confront him directly. I looked into his eyes and asked him, "Did you do all that was in your capacity to stop these riots?" The directness of my question surprised him. After regaining his composure, he replied with moist eyes, "Guruji, do you also believe this propaganda?" Nothing much was spoken after that. I knew he could not have played a role in the riots. Why would a chief minister paint his face black and destroy his own reputation? It didn't make any sense. We sat in silence for a few minutes. I assured him that the truth was on his side, and one day the whole nation would recognize him. On the contrary from this particular testimonial, the Human Rights Watch in 2012 documented how a decade after the anti-Muslim pogroms, Gujarat state and police officials continue to deny and obstruct justice in the investigations. Fast forward to earlier this year when your very own BBC released a two-part documentary, India, the Modi Question, that basically illustrates how Modi greenlit this violence against Muslim communities. And in response, the Indian government and spiritual leaders are dismissing the documentary as propaganda and have banned it from airing in India and other parts of the globe. So I'm going to be tuning in this week while I'm here. After learning more about Sri Sri's support for Modi, I felt betrayed, but I also felt as if a blindfold had been lifted from my eyes. Sri Sri's use of spirituality to bypass the contradictions of Hindu nationalism were telling. In turning a blind eye to Hindutva's violent political agenda, he encouraged me to question my place in spirituality, as well as my place in HSC and the art of living. I was no longer willing to trust their political and theological doctrines, and in my mind and heart, they were complicit in justifying religious supremacy and hatred, supremacist violence, and inequality. The experience validated the tension that I had begun feeling with faith-based practices. Although I had come to these communities with a desire for belonging, for ancestral wisdom, I was fed dangerously manipulative propaganda about South Asian social history through Brahmanical Hindu elitist perspectives. I felt a deep desire to disrupt these political agendas. And unable to reckon with what I'm calling the weaponization of spirituality, I left Art of Living, Hindu Student Council, and my yoga practice for some time. And fast forward to returning to a more secularized yoga practice and traveling to India for my yoga teacher training. The second time that I confronted what I'm calling the weaponization of yoga was when I traveled to my homeland in India, and particularly to McLeodganj, India, for a yoga teacher training at the Kailash Tribal School in 2011. On my local flight to Dharamshala from New Delhi, I sat next to a tourist who was returning to McLeodganj to study yoga and attend a meditation retreat. We shared a cab ride to McLeodganj together, and on that ride, he shared that he was Israeli and that he had come to India many times over the past few years. The first time being after he completed his service in the Israeli military. He boasted to me about how many Israelis come to McLeodganj, India, after their compulsory service in the Israeli military. He shared how similar Israeli and Indian culture are, and how this natural alliance between India and Israel inspires the way that Israelis gravitate towards Indian culture. How they throw wild parties, attend meditation retreats, get their yoga certification, become some of the most popular yoga teachers, and how they often settle in villages in Himachal Pradesh for extended periods of time. So these two cities, Kasol and Dharamkot, or these two villages, right? They're often called Mini Israel. Once we reached McLeodganj together, he emphasized that I must visit Dharamkot. In walking through these villages, I started noticing signs on walking trails and roads, signs marked in Hebrew, but never in Urdu. And the number of menu items in cafes that advertise Israeli salads, or what Arabs in the occupied territories know to be everyday Palestinian salads. I became intrigued by the habitual practice of these soldiers flocking to India after compulsory military service to de-stress from the trauma of serving as agents in a military that aggressively brutalizes and dehumanizes and displaces Palestinians. I began questioning why they traveled to India to study spirituality after completing their service in what Palestinians regard as a settler occupying military force. The observation that these Israeli soldiers were using yoga and mindfulness as tools to relieve the stress they had accrued by participating in the military instead of using these practices as mediums to interrogate their participation in an apartheid state in an occupation military force is what I also understand to be the weaponization of yoga. Rather than using yoga to deepen self-awareness regarding their participation in a genocidal project, decimating Palestinian life, these veterans were using yoga to bypass cultivating such awareness. I had enrolled in a yoga training in India thinking that my major concerns around colonization and yoga would revolve around confronting issues of race and white supremacy and me feeling like a foreigner in my own ancestral country, given the town's flourishing spiritual tourist industry. And honestly, for at least a couple of years after completing my certification, I had a fairly flattened analysis of the relationship between colonization, race, and yoga. But not long after this trip, and largely through the push from oppressed minorities in India, including people of other backwards castes, Dalits, Muslims, right, pushing me and checking me, I started wondering how my analysis could be sharpened to incorporate these observations and these material examples of yoga's weaponization for imperial and supremacist agendas. While the politics of race, identity, and representation in Western yoga spaces has received critical public attention and dialogue about decolonizing yoga, I am largely concerned with how far-right regimes and neoliberal institutions use yoga and mindfulness to conceal repressive state violence and cement global supremacist alliances with each other. I'm simultaneously concerned with the ways that these fascist institutions deploy New Age spiritualities as propaganda to advance projects of ethnonational, colonial, and imperial violence, which is why I focus on the weaponization of yoga by law enforcement, border security, military, government, and vigilante groups, agents of imperial violence. I believe this research can tell us something about the ethical assumptions that the mainstream public holds about yoga and mindfulness. I think it can also tell us something about whose injuries, pain, and trauma are considered worthy of healing, and whose death and injuries, pain, and trauma are considered disposable or unworthy of healing. And finally, I think this research can tell us something about how societies predicated on structural and ethno-national violence and fascist ideals can co-opt spiritual technologies, particularly using the media to serve a broader political agenda. I'm curious about the weaponization of yoga globally, but I'm primarily interested in analyzing the incorporation of yoga in the nations of India, Israel, and the US. Ethnic studies scholar Harsha Walia purports that the alliance between these three nations, she purports it to be the most dangerous far-right ethno-nationalist alliance in the world. Walia also contends that under the guise of fighting illegal immigration, crime, and terrorism, particularly in a post-9/11 context, these three nations have invested more public funding in militarism, border walls, national security, and policing in ways that perpetuate the racialization of Muslims. So, for example, political geographer Rhys Jones documents how these three countries alone, the US, India, and Israel, have built over 3,500 miles of militarized walls on their borders. US military aid to Israel goes up each year and is well above 3.8 billion. That's military aid. And beyond that, the alliance between India and Israel, while initially fragile and two-faced, according to scholar Azad Essa, has been gaining strength since India established full diplomatic relations with Israel in the 1980s and 90s. In fact, Azad Essa purports that the far-right ideologies of Hindutva and Zionism experience a kinship in their expansionist and supremacist values, and in their investment in the occupation of Palestine and the occupation of Kashmir. So what this means for today is that since Prime Minister Narendra Modi entered office in 2014, around 42.1% of all arms exports from Israel have landed in India, making India the largest purchaser of Israeli weapons, many of which are used to police borders with Pakistan and Bangladesh and the occupation of Kashmir. My interrogation of yoga in the US military and prisons is also piqued by the understanding that the US has been at war for 90% of its life. The US controls about 750 bases in at least 80 countries worldwide and spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined. And this is all supplemented by a recognition that the US also cages over 20% of the world's population, most of whom are poor, Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. What all of these kind of related but also isolated facts establish is that together these three nations contribute significantly to a globally imperial military and prison industrial complex that's predicated on far-right ideologies, ethno-nationalist violence, and structurally oppressive racial hierarchies. And as much as, maybe some of this is known in the public, I think we also operate in this context where the media and we experience like imperial amnesia as it relates to memories of war, right? We just hit the 20-year anniversary of the occupation of Iraq, right? And that's rarely in the news, or the humanization of Iraqis is rarely in the news. And so with regard to this research, I'll just read like one of these research questions, the ones that anchor this study. How do legal and law enforcement organizations and individual soldiers, including prisons, military, law enforcement, and border security forces in India, Israel, and the US, articulate the purpose of deploying and participating in yoga and mindfulness programs? And what are the broader political agendas of these institutions, right? What are the public perceptions of yoga in these spaces, right? And what do these findings tell us about the moral and spiritual health of a society and the assumptions that the public places? I'm hoping to start interrogating these questions with you today and to continue interrogating them through fieldwork in the coming years, yeah? So the hope is to go to Dharamkot, to go back to Dharamkot, go back to other parts that are called mini Israel, and to go to other places as well. So I pull from a few bodies of scholarship and existing literature to interrogate the appropriation of yoga and meditation by neoliberal and state authorities. These include scholarship on colonialism, Orientalism, post-colonialism, decolonial and transnational feminist thought. It's also informed by the work of scholars who've discussed how yogis and gurus have historically used yoga as a disciplinary tool for martial masculinity, for somatic and masculine nationalism, to garner their strength to gain independence from Britain. My research is also informed by the work of Andrea Jane, a scholar who's documented the malleability of yoga and yoga's operation within the framework of neoliberal spirituality, a form of spirituality that subverts dominant structures and culture, not through resistance or an emphasis on transforming those structures, but through what she calls gestural subversions, actions that render individual consumers, not state or social institutions or the government, responsible for their physical and spiritual well-being. And building on the relationship between yoga and neoliberalism, sorry, y'all. Moving ahead of myself on the slides. Farah Godrej challenges the pervasive assumption that suggests that doing yoga will automatically lead to large-scale systemic changes in an already unjust, racialized, and classist carceral system. In her scholarship that's informed by qualitative research, including ethnography and personal experiences of teaching yoga in prisons, Godrej considers the conditions of teaching yoga that lead to complicitness in a structurally unjust system, and the conditions that might lead subjects to resist systemic inequalities. My research is informed by Nadia Abu El-Haj, who just published a text on combat trauma. Her work functions here to illustrate how the public and medicalized language of soldier trauma serves to produce a narrative of American soldiers as the only acknowledged casualties of war in a context that evades radical political critique for war. So she's kind of arguing we can have both, yeah? Similarly, Jyoti Puri's work on yoga as soft power shows us how the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, uses the rhetoric of peace and unity in the UN holiday of International Day of Yoga to advance Hindutva or Hindu nationalist policies. Jasbir Puar's work on pinkwashing informs the way that far-right governments use elements of multiculturalism and cultural propaganda to bring seemingly diverse and otherwise unwelcome groups into a radical right agenda. So I'm building on Puar's frame of pinkwashing to study how the far right uses yoga and mindfulness and spirituality as forms of omwashing to divert attention away from their oppressive agendas and their records of state violence. And considering that the scholarship invites us to consider the malleability of yoga and its inclination to be co-opted by neoliberalism and its history of being appropriated to maintain the status quo of racial and casteist hierarchies, I want to challenge the catchy and often gimmicky connotation of yoga as inherently pure, as inherently peaceful, or the more trendy association of yoga as inherently rooted in social justice values. I'd like to believe this claim. I mean, you know, it feels nice to say that, but such associations unfortunately rely on romanticized notions of yoga and its ancient India roots. And this lends itself to be used by the far right as propaganda. So, considering all this, I want to invite us to do a gallery gaze of some images that I've collected. The rules are here, yeah, or the instructions that are suggested, no rules. We're going to engage in a silent meditative activity where we take in images and captions together. It's going to just be us reading them, noticing what we feel, noticing what we see. I just want to invite you to breathe as you look at the images and as you read the prompts. If you see it in quotes, it's usually taken directly from that article. And if there's otherwise caption, you might see a little bit of my language, but it's mostly language from maybe a journalist article or something. Take a breath in and out. So I imagine a lot of us walked away from viewing those images with a lot of thoughts. Feel free to write down your thoughts or reflections, or if you're on Zoom, share it in the chat. I'm sharing these images to begin troubling the application of yoga to militarism, to policing in prisons and amongst vigilante and far-right political leaders. I am concerned with how the weaponization of yoga in these spaces supports projects of imperial and state violence, ethnonationalism, and the status quo of normalizing the suffering and oppression of marginalized communities. Similar to those scholars whose work I'm building on, I'm challenging the assumption that yoga is an inherently positive, peaceful, and pure tradition. We see from these images that yoga is being taught to border security and military personnel in India, Israel, and the US, that it's celebrated as an international holiday by the military and the masses, especially thanks to a political leader who's instigated a genocidal pogrom and advanced the brutal occupation of Kashmir. We see how it is being routinely taught to police officers through Pop to Yoga and Yoga First Responder programs, and to Black and Brown youth who are being disproportionately jailed in the US. We see it being appropriated by military personnel in the army, and to be clear, not by soldiers with an anti-imperial, anti-war analysis, who are eager to interrogate and reckon with their participation in projects of apartheid and state violence, but by soldiers and veterans who want to breathe their stress away after participating in said imperial and occupying army. Often these images are circulated on the internet with captions that encourage viewers to assume that plugging a yoga program into an institution that is founded on structurally violent principles will transform that institution or be less violent, less racist, less colonial, or less imperial. And often the reporters who are discussing these phenomena remark on how the yoga and mindfulness programs in these settings are designed to help military personnel and officers fight better, relieve stress, sleep better, address trauma, and fight their implicit biases. The media here doing the propaganda work of the far-right imperial forces. As an activist, as a scholar, practitioner, these images concern me because they are often lauded as decolonial in their attempt to make yoga accessible and more inclusive to other populations. But I think we must ask ourselves, to what extent is the decolonization of yoga not about incorporating yoga into institutions predicated on imperial violence? Likewise, to what extent is it also not about inserting South Asian or Black, Indigenous, people of color faces into mainstream yoga spaces? Are soldiers doing yoga in an imperial and occupying army going to disrupt projects of state violence, colonial violence? Are they going to suddenly see colonized peoples in Kashmir, in Palestine, and the occupied US territories as less deserving of brutal aggression? Is doing yoga in police training programs going to dismantle the racist and classist project of policing? Will it transform the systematic targeting of poor and undocumented communities of color subject to mass incarceration? If we assume yoga to be inherently pure and peaceful and rooted in social justice values, perhaps we believe it can transform these systemic injustices. However, if we consider yoga to be malleable or neutral, we might be able to understand that these institutions do not become less imperial or less violent with the introduction of meditation and yoga programs. Rather, yoga becomes moldable into the overarching agenda of any institution that co-opts it. I argue that we might consider a deeper analysis of decolonizing yoga, one that actively resists the weaponization of yoga as a colonial and ethno-nationalist tool and roots it in an anti-colonial politics and liberatory ethics. While some of these programs are well-intentioned and reform-minded, I argue that when yoga is being used to propagate ethno-nationalism and racial capitalism and war and imperialism, or rather when it is being weaponized to advance far-right oppressive agendas, that is omwashing. Far-right governments, ethnic and religious groups, and corporations use yoga and spirituality as colonial and ethno-nationalist tools to disguise their society as free and peaceful. Their use of yoga in this way diverts attention from their structurally violent and supremacist ideologies. These are examples of the weaponization of yoga, because in these programs and institutions that are bringing yoga to military and law enforcement personnel, they aren't necessarily encouraging the soldiers or officers to interrogate violence and injustice or dehumanization that they're participating in via war and occupation. They're ultimately encouraging soldiers and law enforcement officers to participate in a process of spiritual bypass and avoid confronting the violence they perpetuate. In other words, they're being encouraged to breathe away the dehumanizing brutality and violence they commit. And so, in conclusion, right, I don't want to necessarily be repetitive, right? Yoga can be used for oppressive agendas, right? It can be used for far right repressive agendas. I do believe it can also be used for liberatory agendas. I also believe that yoga practitioners and scholars who are committed to the work of decolonizing yoga should feel empowered to challenge instances of omwashing or instances of it being used to advance state violence and imperial and colonial agendas. I do believe that we can interrupt omwashing through interrupting programs that make state violence look more benevolent. And as much as this is a talk about the weaponization of yoga, I believe in yoga's liberatory potential. I believe that in order for yoga to be an effective tool for spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical liberation in America, it does need to be couched in an abolitionist and anti-imperial political framework rather than a reformist framework. I would love to talk more about ways that I've sought to practice or seen and embody this in question and answer. I am also curious to hear what all of you think about the examples of how yoga programs are being deployed in these non-traditional institutions, what your takeaway is from the images that you saw. And thank you again to Theo, to Jim for inviting me to share my work, and to all the friends and colleagues who've supported my development of this research. I'm really grateful for your time and excited to be here again with you. So thank you. Where do you want me to be?
We have the two microphones, so hopefully
Okay,
you should be able to
perfect.
hear both of us, which would be great. So yeah, if people on the Zoom call, thank you, want to, I need to be on the right bit. All right, I'm actually, before we start, I'm going to start with a question of my own, because that's always chair's privilege. That's how we do it.
Yay.
Which is nice. But I guess that one of my thoughts with regards to the kind of militarization of yoga, or the use of yoga in military spaces, is that very often kind of the way in is through trauma work, right? So it's with veterans in terms of this sense of rehabilitation, of healing of veterans. And I wondered if you had anything to say about that as being kind of almost a soft edge into things, and a way in which people feel like they're doing good because they are healing individual,
Addressing their trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's really important. I think I've never served in the military, but it creates a space of real physical and psychological harm. And I think that it's really important to have, I think it's really important for soldiers, for law enforcement officers to be able to address their trauma, to use yoga as a medium. So this is not an anti, like, soldiers doing yoga talk. I think what it more so is a question of how it is that states, and imperial states in particular, use yoga to serve their military agenda, right? And whether or not in those yoga programs where they're doing yoga to address trauma, are they inviting those soldiers to kind of think about and interrogate, like, is the self-awareness that's being lifted up through breathing, through building that awareness, is it inviting them to interrogate participation in these armies? And I think the work that I mentioned by Nadia Abu al-Haj combat trauma, I think she talks about how the medicalization of language around PTSD was taken up by during victims of sexual violence and during the Reagan era, and kind of used in this way to kind of evade or kind of drop the analysis of anti-war and anti-imperialism.
I'm aware there's a lovely phrase, I think it's best known in the Diamonds phrase of the pathologization of distress, which is really lovely about the invention of PTSD, like you said, the medicalization of trauma as being about pathologizing distress. And in a similar way, that we pathologize these into what are essentially structural issues into medical issues, and therefore there can be something that fits in a neater box. So I guess to summarize what you're slightly saying is partly it's about the intentionality and the kind of practices that are being done, and also about how those practices are being represented in terms of that process of onwashing as well, right? So it's just
about the propaganda, yeah.
Nice. Okay, so I'm sure we have questions in the room. Any hands up? Ruth is ready on it with the mic.
I just have a quick question, in that maybe it's not so much about yoga as about Islamophobia and anti-Islam that unites those three countries. So maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think especially in a post 9/11 context, it's long going. The project of Islamophobia is much older than 9/11. But I think that a lot of the spending on security, homeland security, a lot of spending on defense, a lot of spending on militarism was in some ways the public stopped asking questions after 9/11, even after India experienced its own attack, I think I can't remember what year exactly, in Mumbai, right? And this public just stopped asking questions when it came to projects of militarism, right? And so I think there's a way in which Muslims are used as the boogeyman by a lot of these states in order to connote terror. And India, I think by some of the genocide watch programs is kind of being lifted up as on stage 6 or stage 5 of genocide watch, right? As it relates to the treatment of oppressed minorities, especially Muslims right now during Ramadan. Maybe we saw, but maybe the media didn't show us, the terrorization of Muslims in Jerusalem, right? In parts of India, using the same military technology, right? It's the same bulldozers that are being used to destroy Muslim, homes in New Delhi and parts of India that are also being used to destroy Palestinian homes in occupied Palestine, right? And I think that there's a way in which, just Islamophobia kind of functions in the way in which these three countries are kind of able to secure their alliances and justify the militarization.
Thank you so much. That was so wonderful. Sorry, I lost my voice. I wanted to ask about the movement from analysis to resistance. I wish to give one really big example, which is the European Union in this country, which has been a really interesting experiment in moving to say a Marxist or workers' rights analysis of how European Union to cover all kinds of worker exploitation, and then to move into active resistance through kind of various forms of precarious worker grassroots organizing. And I would love to know if there might be a vision, or I think it's very unfair to ask for a strategy. And what are our steps? What might strategies be around that movement from analysis to resistance as a very material form of change?
I think that a lot of scholars, movement practitioners more so than scholars, recently have done a lot of work, at least in the US. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with the text Healing Justice Lineages by Kara Page, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm trying to remember who else. But I think the framework of healing justice, which is not necessarily particular to yoga, but that kind of recognizes, it recognizes that trauma is collective, and that trauma is part and parcel connected to these industrial complexes of like the prisons, the military, the medical industrial complex, and the looking at solutions through individualized kind of yoga programs, I don't think is going to get us to a strategy of resistance so much as a recognition of, how do we look back to strategies of survival and collective healing that, our ancestors have used, but also how do we think in forward ways about, how it is that communities that have suffered like the brunt of oppression, right, have put together healing toolkits. Transformative justice is another kind of framework that I look to kind of think about how can yoga be used and embedded in transformative and TJ and restorative justice programs. And I think just being honest with the communities that if you do want to go into, whether it's communities where yoga, I'm seeing yoga as weaponized, or whether it's communities where, if you want to teach yoga in prisons, right? I taught at yoga in a youth prison, even with the recognition of my values as being like, okay, like I wish prisons don't exist, but how can I kind of go into those spaces and not presume that I'm the knowledge holder? But how do I let people in those spaces know that if they want to kind of rest and relax while they're doing, quote unquote, yoga asana, or if they don't really want to kind of like be in that space and feel pressured to do the yoga, right? How can we just kind of like acknowledge and be with each other in those spaces? So I think there's also an element of like humility in how we kind of offer yoga and let people just be in those spaces. But yeah, I think I would look to like the healing justice kind of frameworks. Mm-hmm.
And that does actually bring us to, there's a really good question online from Lawrence, asking, or more kind of making the connection between yoga and the kinds of environments you're talking about and yoga in various kinds of work environments as part of company culture. And this thing about yoga for productivity, mindfulness for productivity and that kind of things. I'm thinking there's so many people who are doing great work on this as well. Shimeen Black's work on flexibility and different kinds of flexibility in workforces is really interesting as well. So yeah, I'm wondering how much you're connecting this issue to that wider issue of how yoga is used essentially as a way of kind of almost Foucauldian kind of discipline of the body in order to maintain systemic values.
Yeah, I think there's that famous tweet that gets kind of circulated every once in a while where it's like, I'm really stressed at work, right? And the company's like, oh, great, we'll introduce yoga program, or, like basically like, can we hire more workers is maybe what like the laborer says, like, can we hire more workers so that we're not as stressed? And then the corporation's like, no, not like that. Like, let's just try yoga, right? And so I think that there is room to kind of really just question, like, what is the intention, especially if it's being offered during a lunch break, right? What if, those workers just want to kind of enjoy TikTok or just like, unplug during their lunch break, as opposed to kind of like feeling that there's like this mandatory yoga program. So yeah, I think there's interesting stuff. I haven't read all the research on it. So I'd be intrigued too, but I think that I would raise a lot of questions around yoga being used in banks, in corporations, because in the end of the day, is it to get the worker to be more productive so that they complain less, right? I think that kind of is the way in which neoliberalism works, is that it invites these individualized solutions as opposed to like structural ways of thinking about stress as created by the economic systems in which we inhabit.
All right, Jim just
Oh,
wants a quick moment for tech.
Really
please.
sorry to interrupt, 'cause I've got to go. I'm
Okay.
going to grab this. I'm
Oh,
going to swap
yes,
you with
yes,
Ruth.
yes.
Yeah.